Hello and welcome to Understanding Emotions. My name is Sankalp. Have you ever wanted to get better at something? Like maybe you wanted to learn to play the guitar, which is hiding right behind there. Or have you wanted to get better at chess? Or have you wanted to ace your studies? Or have you wanted to learn a new language? And all sorts of challenges that learning presents to us. Like, have you ever wanted to learn social skills and be less nice? And whatever growth you want to have in life is on the other side of mastering learning. So, in this special episode today, I have with me Scott Young. Scott is the author of two books on learning, Ultra Learning and his new book, Get Better at Anything. Now, Scott is extraordinary. He has done some phenomenal projects on his own. For example, he did an entire MIT computer science degree, which was 4 years in just 1 year. Like he self-studied it, and he had a lot of principles of learning that he talks about in the podcast that he applied. He has learned multiple languages. He's learned to draw and has been maintaining a blog for a really long time about learning. You'll see he's extremely knowledgeable about the science, especially the cognitive psychology of learning. And he goes really deep into like, how do you learn? If I learn chess, does that transfer to my academics? And if I learn chemistry, does anything like sort of transfer? Like, is the mind a muscle? All of these issues he is an expert at. And we cover a lot of breadth. We talk about directness versus building blocks. So for example, if I want to sit a competitive exam, do I solve the problem sheet first or do I build my concepts? We talk about transfer, which is, does learning one thing improve my learning in some other thing? And we talk about standardized testing and many other issues of learning. So you will find this is a deep dive in learning. Scott was extremely generous to explain these concepts and offer some practical tips. And I hope you enjoyed this episode of Understanding Emotions with Scott Young. I have Scott Young with me here today. Scott, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Right. So I just want to like dive right in, and you've
Sure.
written a new book called
Yes.
Get Better at Anything. And I know you tend to be the world's expert at learning. So I'm just curious about, just to get into this, what is the book about and how does it
Yeah.
differ from Ultra Learning, which was your previous book?
Yeah, I mean, well, you mentioned it, like learning has been something that I've been intensely interested in for a long time. And so, I mean, I even before I wrote Ultra Learning, I had multiple courses and ebooks and stuff on learning. So, in some ways,
Mm.
this is just the topic I keep returning myself to. And I kind of joked, I wrote a post after the book came out that, I could probably write a dozen of these books if people would want to read them. Like, I love learning, I love this topic, and there's so many things to explore it. So it's definitely not a topic where like, all right, well, I can write it out on a pamphlet. This is everything that you could possibly know about it. It's, cognitive science. There's just an amazing amount of research, an amazing amount of ideas that are important. So the reason for writing this book was in part to tackle some of the ideas and concepts that I wasn't really able to tackle in ultra learning. So the framing for ultra learning was, of course, I'm sort of assuming people know what this book is about, but the framing for ultra learning was myself and other people who had taken on these intense self-directed learning projects. So, I opened the book with some of my stories, doing this MIT challenge, trying to learn MIT's computer science curriculum in 12 months, learning multiple languages in a year, these kinds of projects, but also lots of other really interesting people. Benny Lewis, he speaks like about a dozen languages. Eric Barone, who built a video game all by himself. I wanted to focus on these individuals, these people who had sort of an exceptional ability to learn hard things, and sort of try to dissect that. And in particular, with this focus on these self-directed learning projects. So again, focusing on people who were taking these initiatives themselves as opposed to, the typical medical student or the person who's in an elite research, economics PhD, who they're also probably studying pretty hard, but they're under the auspices of a much more formal institution. And so the story that kind of got me down writing a new book was actually about Tetris. And so Tetris seems like sort of an offbeat example, but I discovered that the Tetris players, Tetris has been around for a long time. They've gotten a lot better at the game quite recently. So the game's been around for, I don't know, over 30 years. But it's really only been in the last decade that people who have been playing the game have gotten much, much, much better. And it looked like the reason why this was happening was because until very recently, it was very difficult to communicate and share the right ways to play Tetris. So basically, kind of techniques and innovation sort of stagnated.
Mm.
And I thought this was really interesting because, like, while of course there are some really fantastic players and individuals who put in a lot of effort to get really good at this, but it was also the kind of story that like wouldn't have fit into ultra learning. It was not a story about an individual. It was about here's a basic ingredient for learning, the ability to learn from other people and how that changed. And so that kind of set me off the path of doing a lot more research into different educational systems, different ways that people learn, different environments. And so I think this new book gives a kind of a different perspective on learning that's complementary to the other one, but highlights things that maybe I wasn't able to talk about in that book.
Sure, sure. Yeah. And you start the book with the Tetris story, which was quite fascinating, I must say. As someone who's like grown up playing chess, for me, there is a lot of that collective wisdom in chess, and I don't know if you can trace the development of that to one person. And perhaps you're highlighting something of the similar sort. I do want to sort of there's a lot there, and I do want to take a little bit of a second. I just want to open the second branch because this is a show about psychology and emotional intelligence. And for me, what I've been fascinated with as someone who is like doing a PhD, just being a student, career student so far, is just this thrill and joy and confidence and emotional thriving, so to speak, that comes from learning.
Yeah.
So I was just curious, before we talk into the details and nitty-gritties of learning, what do you think is this payoff of learning that we're all after? And what is this, what is the promise of learning?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I kind of think that some of our highest highs and lowest lows are tied up with learning. Highest highs, I mean, that feeling of mastery, that feeling of accomplishment. I mean, there's few things in the world that are quite like it. I mean, this is what elite athletes are chasing. This is what we're chasing in our careers. This is what we're chasing when we're doing. I mean, it's nice to say, oh yeah, it's nice to, earn $1 million or have people applaud you, but feeling like you're really good at something is a kind of intrinsic motivation that I think is much deeper than that, just deeper than like these sort of outward signs of success. And so that highest high of being able to learn well, of being able to do it well is one of the sort of deep things I think we're after as human beings. But at the same time, it's also an area where if you are not doing it well, if you're struggling, it can be some of the lowest lows. So, when I was doing the podcast kind of circuit, so to speak, with ultra learning, that was the conversation topic that kept coming up. Is you'd have people who'd be like, well, I didn't like school and I had this sort of problem. And so I'm interested in your book, but you talk about learning and I just have this like, kind of feeling about it. And I think a lot of people have had that. A lot of people have, experienced boredom, you've experienced confusion, frustration, low self-confidence. So there's also all these negative emotions as well. So really, I think the emotional component of learning is like, it's so tied up in it. It's certainly not in a emotionally neutral kind of activity. It's one of the most charged ones that we engage in.
Sure. I'm curious how you would place skills like social skills or emotional intelligence in contrast to things that we typically think of learning, like math or physics. And do you have like a system of classification? And I know uncertainty is something that you have included in the book, but do you have like a map that you place these different skills in and how they might change our approaches to learning?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting way. I think whenever you're categorizing anything, there's so many different ways you can slice it up, right? So there's probably one way you could slice it up, it'll look different from another way. I think one slice that I find helpful is sort of comparing, this is the evolutionary psychologist David Geary came up with this idea of like biological primary and biological secondary skills. And the idea being that we are an evolved organism and our brain has evolved to learn and acquire certain kinds of knowledge and abilities almost effortlessly, sort of through participation in our culture, through participation in our environment. And there are other skills which are too recent. They've come around too quickly that we have not developed specific mechanisms for learning. And so those tend to be the things that even if we do acquire them, they require effort and instruction and guidance. So the classic contrast is like learning to speak a language versus learning to read a language. Like learning to speak is something that, absent extreme deprivation or cognitive deficits, every single person learns their native language to a relative native level of fluency. I mean, we're not all going to be poets and wordsmiths, but everyone can speak their native language fluently, even if they, are a terrible math student or a terrible student in other ways. In contrast, learning to read, aside from this very recent part of history, almost no one learned to read. It was a difficult skill. And even now, it requires a lot of years of instruction. Most students don't just spontaneously pick up learning to read if they are not taught how to do it. So social skills is one of those areas where it goes between these sort of gaps. So there's a lot of elements of social skills that are arguably these biological primary skills. They're these skills that we have evolved to acquire. So there's a lot of stuff about social skills that does not need to be taught, and teaching it explicitly is maybe not always helpful, right? So we learn social norms, we learn how to communicate, things like eye contact. For most people, they don't need to be taught how to do those things. Maybe some people who have social difficulties can deal with some coaching. But for the average person, if you were telling them to be like really explicit about how much eye contact they're making, they're going to be weird. Like it's not going to be normal. However, there's also a lot of elements, like social skills is a big umbrella, right? So there's certain social skills that probably are sort of unnatural. And even if they tap some of these evolutionary primary skills, they are things that require modifications. So the classic example I think of is public speaking is something that conversations, monologuing, what I'm doing right now, is very natural, but standing on a stage and talking nonstop without conversational rhythms is unnatural for most people. So it takes some adaptation. It takes some not only overcoming the fear of public speaking, but just getting used to doing that. I would say that there's lots of social skills that kind of fit that category, that they like kind of lean on skills that we've already developed, but you probably have to acquire some additional skills in order to actually be good at them. You're not just automatically good at them for participating in our culture.
Sure. Would you say the principles of your book, which, for example, looking at solved problems, they easily translate across these biological primaries and secondaries, or do you think you have written up this book particularly for one
I
or
mean,
the other?
this distinction, I focus a lot more, I would say, on the kind of skills that you have to acquire in the book. And part of this is just because a lot of these skills that we have evolved to acquire, we do just acquire them without a lot of it. Like there's not as much to do about it, right? Like I don't need to write a book about how to acquire your native language because everyone does it before. I need to write a book about how when you're 25 do you learn another language, because people find that hard. So there's some sense that the first book doesn't need to be written. But you're right, a lot of people want to improve their social skills. So even if there is some sense in which they're in the biological primary category, and a lot of that stuff we learn automatically, we're not always satisfied with that, and we have to learn new things. So, I mean, there's lots of different ways. I'm sure we could, like, if you want to get into social skills and communication skills specifically, that's a rabbit hole we could talk about for 90 minutes right there. But just to say about problem solving, I think a lot of these skills that are, I would say, kind of a little bit like a calibration of a skill that you don't think about consciously, that it doesn't go through this phase of like thinking about it explicitly and then being able to execute it. You do have to approach them a little bit differently. So movement skills are another one that like, it often is not the best way to learn a movement skill to think too explicitly about which muscles are involved. Like that's actually an impediment to doing it, because we have at some sort of unconscious level these modules in our brain for dealing with muscle movements. And to override that, you can override it, but to override it with conscious thinking is somewhat unhelpful. So you have to do this kind of like, you have to do this sort of conscious effort to guide your training environment, but don't think too much about what you're actually doing. And so I think there's probably something similar with social skills, that you want to be, if you're improving them, you want to be doing things that are going to guide your conversations in useful directions, but not overthinking it. So I have a friend, I actually featured him in the previous book, Ultra Learning, Tristan de Montebello. And like he runs a speaking consultancy now called Ultra Speaking. And I mean, most of what they do is getting people to just use the conversation skills that they have sort of naturally and having conversations and feel comfortable using them on stage. So it's a lot about like managing emotions and inhibition and things like that. They're not really teaching you like, oh, here is the mechanism for being persuasive or telling a witty joke. So I mean, that's sort of an interesting kind of area where you have a lot of intuitive skills that are not learned explicitly, but you have to bring them to bear on a new problem.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I do want to avoid the temptation of going just into social skills, because also
Well, it's
my
your
PhD
podcast.
is
We
on
can talk about whatever you want, right?
No, but I think the listeners would appreciate me not talking more about it, just because it's my PhD topic as well.
Right.
It's a bit of a pet topic. But there's another thing that you did say earlier, which I did wanted to go deeper into, which is fear. And also this corresponding topic of like what we think of is our identity. So an example would be, I'm not a math person, or I've just never been good at singing.
Right.
And that also tends to have a very clear parallel with mental health and well-being. So I guess my question here is, what do you think is this relationship between what our identity is and our ability to learn?
Right.
And which way do you think is a useful change to make? Do I improve my ability to learn and this improves my identity? Or should I try working on like mental health, CBT, and that would improve my ability to learn?
I mean, CBT is a lot of stuff. It is also, looking at beliefs and things like that too. So it's also that kind of work. I don't know. I think, so I think it can go both ways. I personally, my kind of default assumption with human behavior is that like, my default assumption, I don't want to say like the ending assumption, my default assumption is that behavior tends to be rational. So we don't do things for no reason. So when you see something pathological, there's usually a good reason behind it, is my kind of assumption when I'm looking at things. Sure. So when someone says I'm not a math person, my first intuition is not to be like, oh, well, that's so bad. Why do people do that? But it's sort of like, what function does that serve? Like, why would that be beneficial? And then why would that occasionally misfire? And so I think the functionality of having these kinds of identity labels is because, well, frankly, like, especially if we're talking about, life in modern society, you don't need to be good at everything. Most things you don't need to be good at. We live in a society that is even more specialized than it was in the past. And so there's lots of areas of life where it actually just makes rational sense not to be good at that thing, right? So if you're not a math person, but you're a stand-up comic, like who cares, right? Like it doesn't matter, unless you're going to be becoming a physicist or in quantitative finance, maybe you don't need to be really good at math. And so the label, I'm not a math person, is just a little heuristic to just be like, well, avoid these things and focus on the things you're good at, which is maybe a good idea in some things. Like I am not a particularly good dancer, let's say. I know that about myself. Now, does that mean that like, at some deep down level, I couldn't become really good at it? No, probably not. But it does mean I've got lots of other hobbies that I find more enjoyable, that I have maybe a little bit more aptitude for, and I can go in that direction. So these kinds of identity labels, I don't think are per se harmful, but I think they can be harmful, especially when we can't avoid them. So I'm bad at public speaking, but I have to public speak for this particular project role, and then I'm finding ways to avoid it. So there's that. And then I think it can also be artificial when we take this heuristic and make it into this truth about ourselves, right? And I think people really like to do that. I think we really like to form very definite pictures of ourselves in ways that can be limiting, both in strengths and weaknesses. So, it's the same reason why people love learning styles theory, even though it's not true, is that people love, I'm a visual learner, I'm an auditory learner, because it takes the ambiguous, uncertainty of your own life and your identity of who you could be, and it pins you down. I'm this. And that's going to help me make decisions in my life. And so I do think there can be problems because you form these identities that tend to be kind of rigid. We keep repeating themselves to each other, and they form these little like boxes that we're in. And life can change. You can be in scenarios where that box isn't a good fit for the situation. And if you are really holding tight to that, it can be problematic. So I do think it's functional a lot of the times. We don't have to be good at everything. It's okay to have strengths and weaknesses and not to worry about being a master of every single thing that we encounter. But at the same time, it's good to realize that these are just little stories we tell ourselves. They're not always the ground truth of what we're capable of.
Sure. Yeah, I wrote down this example of let's say I want to create, I want to learn music, and that's
Right.
the sort of project I want to create for myself. The So now I have these various options. Like I could play the guitar, I could play the piano, I could learn to sing, and I noticed that if let's just take the piano versus singing, there is something about singing that would evoke that sort of sense of like, I can't do this, or I've been told that I have a bad voice, that may
Oh,
not
really?
happen as much, I think, with instruments. So do you not have this sense? I think there's much more of that identity with the
Um,
voice and projecting the voice.
Well, I mean, I think they're probably well, first of all, if you're singing, I mean your physicality has like I don't have the same voice that you have, and a large part of that
Mm,
is that, the size of my larynx and lungs and that, that's going to be something that's very
sure.
hard to change, right? So if the reason you don't like your voice is because
Mm,
I would like to be a baritone and I'm not, like there's maybe not that much you can do about it, right? So there's things that just physically would restrict you. But I don't think that's just true of singing. I mean, that's like it's the same reason that I don't have aspirations to be an NBA player because, I'm under 6 feet tall. It would be I'd have to be extremely
mm,
talented at basketball to overcome that disadvantage.
mm,
So there
mm.
are these kinds of like just constraints generally on doing things. But to ask your question about, does singing feel like it's more talent, less skill based than piano? I don't know. I don't know whether that's true. I think maybe it's partly true because, again,
Mm,
singing is probably more biologically primary, right? Like you learn to sing somewhat
sure.
without instruction. Very few people learn to play the piano without instruction. And so there is this
Mm,
kind of, the biological secondary skills feel like, okay, if I just put in the effort, I could learn it. Whereas if you're not good at the primary
mm,
ones, it's sort of like, well, what do I even do? But I'm not sure that's true at the high level. I think if you were to be like an opera singer or, someone with a lot
sure.
of training, there probably is quite a bit of skill in like, being on
Mm,
key and singing and vibrato and holding your breath. It's just not obvious. That's not the same as like, me humming a little ditty right now.
yeah, yeah. Like when I was growing up, I don't know how much you know about the Indian context, but there are lots of like competitive exams
Yeah.
that you give, um, and there's a bit of a different question there, which
Yeah.
is when I read your first book, Ultra Learning, I think your first principle is probably directness, and now, or one of the
Yeah.
principles,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and now that I look back, I think the thing I was missing in that sort of approach was directness. Like I would go back and probably solve more problems that would be
On the
closer to what I
exam.
would get in the exams.
Yeah.
Yeah, as opposed to what the way I did it, which was, like build foundations, like learn like the most
Yeah.
theoretical physics book. But now in Get Better at Anything, I see that sort of principle has a bit of a U-turn or a flip side that you're
Well,
highlighting,
yeah.
which is there is a argument to be made for building blocks and building things on each other. So I was just wondering if I could
Yeah.
take this moment to square those two seemingly
Right.
opposites, and how would you approach
Well, so
that
first of all, I
balance?
would say even in ultra learning, I wasn't fanatical about this directness principle. I suggested it as a principle, particularly I think for
Mm,
self-directed learning projects, because when you're not doing the thing that you're trying to get good at, there's a concomitant risk that you're learning the wrong skills. And so I think this is
mm,
particularly true for the context of ultra learning. I want to be good at language X, but I'm not practicing it. I'm doing some
mm,
other activity. Very risky. However, I'm a language teacher and I'm designing a language teaching class. Now, I personally would probably weight the class to have quite a bit of conversation practice. That's my predilection. But as a teacher, knowing the skills that need to be taught and knowing that maybe the students are not going to be using it immediately, I wouldn't say that's the only
mm,
valid curriculum you could develop. So I
mm,
think there's a few points here that are worth separating about these ideas. So first of all, I'm a big synthesizer. So like my way of thinking about things is some people say X and some people say not X. And it's sort of like some people are like, I'm team X or I'm team not X. Whereas I'm
mm-hmm.
the kind of person who's like, how are they both right? Like, what is the principle that,
Sure.
bridges that span? And so for me, one of the things that it came as apparent in this bridging the span is cognitive load theory was like a major bridge of like making sense of why you want to build the foundations in certain scenarios and why you want to go straight and do realistic practice in other scenarios. And
Mm,
so cognitive load theory, it's a major part of the book, a major theme that keeps coming up and up and up again. But the basic idea is that when the skill is too complicated, you're not able to keep it all in your head at the same time. You're not able to keep track of it. breaking things down, doing drills, doing part practice, focusing on specific parts, building up the sort of component skills before you move to the full performance is going to be beneficial. When the cognitive load is lower, then you have weaknesses with this sort of atomizing approach. So, it's funny. This was an explanation that came to me that I understood this theory after ultra learning. So I probably would have written it into ultra learning if I had understood it at the time. I had sort of my own way of going through it. But I mean, I can even think about this when I was learning languages, that when I was learning Spanish, I didn't use that many flashcards. I just didn't. I was just like, I don't need them. I just found them kind of annoying and useless. Whereas when I was learning Mandarin Chinese, I did tons of flashcards. And I didn't really have a good explanation for why that was the case, but now it makes total sense. Well, the cognitive load was totally different. Spanish is very similar to English. I could very easily pick up new words in context because I had enough words that when someone would say a word, I'd be like, oh, what does that mean? And then they could explain it to me. Whereas in Mandarin Chinese, that wasn't possible to do. I'd hear someone say a sentence and I couldn't understand anything they were saying. So, that's a language that's from the same domain. So it's not even like there's a rule that says, well, these types of skills, it's better to be direct, and these skills, it's better to be building blocks. It really is one of these things where it depends on where you're at. And so a lot of the actual educational research, I think, favors, it definitely favors the sort of building blocks approach in the early stage. But this also depends on having good teachers who know what the building blocks are and can break it down. So again, going back to the ultra learning context, I still think if you're going to do a self-directed learning project, it helps to have directness in from the beginning, just because you need that sort of overall feedback loop of, am I even learning the right things? And that's harder to do if you're doing your own self-directed learning. If you're in a class and someone says, just study this, I would say, yeah, if you're studying for a standardized exam, it helps to do the exam questions. But if I don't know any physics, like I haven't learned any physics, and they're asking me like college level physics questions, I mean, I'm going to want to read the textbook first and have them explain F equals ma and all that kind of stuff. So I do think this cognitive load theory, this idea that there's going to be a transition point of where it matters. I mean, it doesn't always give the most practical advice because you never know exactly where the cognitive load sits, but it does at least explain in theory what you should expect to see for what will be more efficient for learning in different scenarios.
Right. Yeah. Also, I think that there's room to care about the outcome, right? In the standardized example, there is a clear outcome that I want, which may even surpass sometimes the outcome of understanding in itself. And it's probably not ideal. It's like I would not want to do it as a learner, but ultimately that's you have like a limited 1 year, 2 year time period that you're preparing at, and there's lots more time in the world than later to really grasp the concepts and become a better engineer.
I mean, the best design test should force the learning that the test makers desire. So if I'm designing the ultimate physics test, I would not do a lot of the things that people do in typical physics classes. Like physics classes, they have stereotyped problems in various stereotyped scenarios. Like the variability, basically, of the physics problems that you do in a typical class are extremely constrained. Sometimes the thing you're doing on the final exam is exactly the same as one of the ones you did on the homework. So like you don't need to understand any principle. You just need to remember how to do that exact problem. And I admit there's some trade-offs and difficulties here because, I think for a lot of physics professors, they say, well, if I did the kind of problems that you would encounter in real life as a physics student, it would just be too difficult for most students. And that's probably true, but that's also probably a side effect of like, we're not taking seriously how hard it is to learn some of these subjects. But I think, what you're saying is true, that in a realistic scenario, where you actually are trying to learn something for a test, for a class, for a job interview, for those kind of things, the test is not going to perfectly match what the test creator hoped it was going to measure. And so doing the test is often beneficial because, like, again, I don't want to be the person saying, oh, yeah, you should just like learn to the test and not actually understand the things. That's not what we want. But certainly in a highly competitive situation where the goal is to win the competition, if you're not taking that into account, you're not going to be optimal because you're going to be learning a lot of stuff that's not actually going to be, it's not going to be necessary to go to that level in order to be able to perform.
Right. Yeah. So this actually does raise this question of what do you think is the status of tests right now? Like speaking on a more systems level of education and testing, be it standardized or be it more like college level testing that you're tested at the end of term? Do you think the tests
Yeah.
are like, are we designing good tests? Is it matching what we want as individuals and societies?
I mean, I do think it's a general problem with tests that the thing that we want the class to test is often not what's tested on the test.
Sure.
But I think I don't want to be like, I think it's very easy to bash existing educational practices. This is something I go on podcasts. Isn't school terrible? And listen,
Yeah.
the way we do, should we throw everything out? And it's just like, these are hard problems. So I don't want to be overly critical of someone who's doing it, because there's always these trade-offs. Like, I mean, there's a reason why we have the exam format that we do, and we do pencil and paper. And like, you know, even though these things aren't that realistic, because like if the way you test your undergrad physics is like, all right, kids, let's go to CERN and you're going to design an experiment. I mean, like, this is just not realistic, right? So, so I don't know. I personally, I think one of the problems, and this is maybe something that is a little bit more fixable, but it has this issue, is that we don't teach things deeply enough in the classes that we're learning them. So there's probably a breadth depth trade-off, that we're like trying to cover too much material and not going deep enough. Again, it depends on what the end goal is of the learning, but I would say for a lot of students who are, let's say, in an undergraduate physics class, and maybe they're not, their terminal goal is not to become physicists, but to be engineers, or to have, you know, some kind of profession that would maybe benefit from good physics intuition, then I think part of the problem is that we, you know, it's good to teach those standardized problems, but we don't have enough variation. There's not enough variability. And so realistically, in real life, you're very rarely encountering a problem that looks the format that the physics problem is. And so because we're not doing enough variable practice there, you're not building a skill that can actually transfer to the real life situation. A better example would be, let's say, algebra, right? Algebra is something that, you know, kids struggle with. We spent a long time explaining how algebra works and this kind of thing. But I mean, we only test them usually in the context of algebra and maybe some word problems that are like highly stereotyped. But rarely are we in a situation where like, here's a quantitative problem that turns out algebra is the right way to solve it. And then, you know, just think through it, right? Like, we're not usually in that situation. And so you have people that like, they know algebra. If you give them an algebra problem, they know how to like, you know, move, separate variables. Maybe they can even remember, oh, the quadratic equation. I remember something about that. Do some factoring.
Right.
But if you were to give them like a real life scenario, which involves some numbers, they're just going to be like, oh, wow, yeah, I don't know what to do there. You know, and so there's a trade-off, I think. There's always trade-offs in these goals, but I do think that's a good reason to be critical of sometimes our educational practices, is that in our sort of rush to reach this pinnacle of academic knowledge, there's so little work on how would this apply more broadly, that essentially a lot of skills that we learn in education are completely inert if you don't have further training. Like, if you don't learn on the job how to apply the algebra to this situation, you're unable to use it because you haven't done enough practice.
Yeah. This is I was going to come at this later, but I think it will fit very well, which is the idea of transfer and how do skills transfer from one domain to the other. So coming back to chess, which is something I was taught at. One of the selling points of chess for my parents was that this is going to help me be a better problem solver. It's going to help me in school, and it's going to help me like strategic decision making and all of that. And I mean, I'm only using chess as an example, but do you think that happens, and or do you think this is like just good marketing? And to what extent?
I think it's good marketing. No, I don't want to be too pessimistic. I think chess is really cool, and so if you're interested in learning chess, that's great. But the benefits of learning a lot of these intellectual subjects that don't have practical applications, they're often, I think, oversold. So I don't like the studies that measure chess proficiency and transfer to other real world measures of problem solving ability. I mean, they're not great. So the ones that show positive results, like there was a meta-analysis that I cite in the book. And the meta-analysis was sort of like, well, you can find these studies that say, okay, you learn chess and then you're good at these problem-solving measures. But basically, the better the study is, the lower the results is. And most of these studies are bad and they're badly controlled. So I don't want to say there's like a definitive, chess doesn't work for anything answer yet. Or that if you I'm going to say this and then there's going to be someone who's going to like send me a study and be like, well, look at this study that showed that, we took 8 people who were really interested in chess and they turn out to be smart at other things, and like, doesn't this prove you wrong, kind of a kind of like terrible argument. But I just think the evidence certainly leans away from that. So, I mean, there's undoubtedly, I think there is a kind of what's called, psychologists call it near transfer. So they tend to distinguish far transfer and near transfer. Near transfer is the kind of, it's sort of colloquial, but near transfer is the transfer you think's going to happen, and far transfer is the transfer you hope's going to happen. So near transfer is like, if I play squash and then I learn tennis, there's probably going to be some transfers. So we call it near transfer, right? Because racket sports are kind of the same. Far transfer is more usually like I play chess and then all of a sudden someone gives me a math problem that doesn't use any chess and like I'm better at it. And that looks more doubtful. I don't think it exists. And where it does exist, it's probably not that big a deal. And I think, again, a lot of the studies on expertise. So how do people play chess? What is going on in a chess grandmaster's head that makes them good at chess is a lot of stuff that's like, I don't want to say it's like memorizing positions. It's more complicated than that, but it's like essentially having this really large library of like chess positions, moves, known methods. Like, it's all stuff that's specific to chess. This is not stuff that like will generalize to a different subject. So is there no reason to study chess then? Well, no, I think there can sometimes be emotional benefits. So like if you succeed in chess and you are able to be successful in competitions, maybe that gives you some sort of emotional self-regulation of like, this is how I can handle myself under pressure. And I think usually when people who really succeeded in some hobby or domain and then talk about how it gave them all these benefits in their life, that's usually what they're talking about. I don't think people are usually saying that like, oh, well, because I know the Berlin defense, that really helped me in formulating this business contract. Like, no one says that because it obviously doesn't help. But I mean, usually they're just like, oh, sizing up my opponent or having these like, I mean, maybe there's some benefit there. So I don't want to be like overly dismissive about that. But at the same time, if that's the benefit that you're getting and you wanted to be good at like formulating business contracts, I mean, formulating business contracts would probably teach you even more than chess. So there is this sort of like, indirectness where it's sort of like, well, I think this argument for learning chess only really makes sense if you already wanted to learn chess. If you had no interest in chess, it's not a good argument.
Yeah, so I mean, if I were to draw some like inferences, and correct me if I'm wrong, but let's say with this whole parental idea that let's put your kid into chess so that they become better at studies or math, and then they might be doing something that is the opposite, because at least chess is going to hog the time, and whatever time this kid might have put into math would not go to chess. So would it be a fair inference to say that it might be counterproductive if your aim is this general grade increase?
I mean, if we take it to an extreme and let's like, okay, I want my kid to pass the what do you guys have as the major? Is it the the major engineering exam that all the Indian JEE, all the Indian students are messaging you like, oh my god, I'm stressing about this exam. Only like 0.01% of kids get into it. So I mean, if I was a parent and I was like, okay, my kid is gonna pass this and go to an IIT. Then like, giving them an intensive starting at 3 STEM-based curriculum, no sports, don't go outside and see the sunshine. And I'm just going to grind them down with problems. So like maybe that would work. I don't know whether that's like, I don't know, maybe I'm too Western and like I don't have the will to force my kids to do that. But I mean, that sounds pretty awful to me too. So I don't think, I think that there is, I don't think the argument for breadth or for learning chess or for things like this can be justified on transfer grounds. So I think it's difficult to make the argument that, well, it's actually better for you to learn chess than to learn math for math. Like the time spent studying chess is more useful than learning math. I think that's really hard to make that argument work, given what we know. But I don't think I think that doesn't necessarily make the like, well, we should spend 100% of our time learning math. That doesn't make that argument true. I think just as human beings, there's always an explore-exploit trade-off, right? Like you can really specialize in one extremely narrow field, but then if that doesn't turn out to be a winning opportunity, you're screwed, right? So like even, I mean, chess is maybe not the most like practical field to be good at. But I mean, I would much rather have my kids learn a bunch of skills, most of which turn out to be useless, but it gives them a foundation so that if they need to pivot, they need to move to new fields, they need to be flexible, they already have some of, like, they're not just this like incredibly narrow, boring person. But that's not really a transfer argument. That's just more of a like, it's more of like a portfolio argument. If you're going to make like financial investments and, you know, like, putting all of your money in one stock. Yeah. If that's the stock that's going to pay off, then okay, well, that's probably the mathematically optimal thing, but it's an incredibly risky strategy. So I think of it, it's more of a different way of looking at it than the transfer argument.
Sure. Yeah. That sounds like a skill. Diversify your skill.
Yeah.
You will, one of this thing you might be good at and might be able to either enjoy yourself or make money or whatever your outcome there is.
Yeah, if you were a chess prodigy, I mean, there'll be some interesting stories when you're an adult later. So like, why not?
That too.
Yeah.
That too. Yeah, I mean, just spend one more minute on chess, which is, I think there is something, there is some analogous learning with analogy that happens. Like, for example, the time it takes to learn an opening, it does give me a bit of sense of how much work I need to put in, even when I'm writing my thesis. It's some sort of a sense of like the level of preparation needed to mastery, which I'm sure I can get with the guitar and other areas. But I guess there might be these analogous meta learning concepts that you might
definitely. I mean, I made the whole, like, I've written 2 books about kind of learning how to learn. So I can't be of the, you know, convinced belief that there's no meta here, right? Like, you know, I got one of the sort of criticisms I had of the book. I remember reading a negative comment about the new book, and they didn't like that I was saying, well, I'm cautiously optimistic about these idea of like meta principles, but like, obviously I believe in them, right? Like, I'm writing about this stuff. I just mean that it's not I would not say it's like rigorously determined from the research that like, okay, that there's this idea of meta learning, but obviously I believe in it. And I think particularly as we move away from, you know, these kind of psychological studies where we're giving people learning tasks in these highly constrained environments, and you move more and more to the real world where you have things like emotional self-regulation, like you have to think about practice, you have to think about what you're doing. I mean, there is probably a lot of meta generalizable principles there. I mean, when I approach a new subject, I have so much more appreciation of what goes into a learning project than I did when I was like 17. So even if I don't know anything about the subject, it would help me immensely because I know how to memorize things. I know how to study. I know how to allocate my time. And like, so in that sense, I think if you spent a lot of time learning chess in a competitive domain and you got really good at it, it could actually be beneficial to other domains simply because, you know, chess has this this sort of known training procedure, this known competitive environment. So it might like be a good place to learn some of those meta skills that maybe is harder to acquire like on the job where like the environment doesn't naturally suggest it. So I don't want to be like, I don't want to rule those out. My argument is a much more specific and technical one about skill transfer.
Yeah. Makes sense. Right. Since we are on meta learning, first of all, I do think that word can be a bit daunting for what it is. So could you just, for the benefit of the listener, could you just briefly tell us what meta learning is?
Right. So meta is often a prefix that's added to things when they're about themselves or like at a higher level of abstraction. So meta learning is learning about learning, right? So what I mean by meta learning, this was the first principle of my previous book, was just before you learn something, like there's content knowledge, but then there's also what's the right way to learn it. So if you're thinking about learning a language, there's vocabulary words. But a meta learning question is, what's the right way to learn vocabulary words, right? And so those are different. I could know, like, there's lots of research on learning vocabulary. I think I wrote a blog post summarizing an entire textbook that was like about learning vocabulary. So, you know, I maybe don't know any words in Mongolian, but I know a lot about, well, what are the things that have to go into learning Mongolian vocabulary words? And so I think that's sort of a distinction that's important. And as you become more self-directed in your learning, as you get older, you're out in the wild, you're not in the, you know, confines of the grade 2 environment where you're being told exactly how to study. There's so many more degrees of freedom about how you might pursue things. And so you can be a smart person and have bad meta learning. And you can have just wrong ideas about how learning works. I go on these podcasts and I talk to people, and people still to this day will bring up like learning styles theory, which has been like so resoundingly debunked. I'm surprised people keep bringing it up, but it shows people that like they're looking at like, how can I, I'm an auditory person. How do I make this an auditory thing? And I'm like, that's not a thing. Like, don't worry about that, And so meta learning is not just at the general level. Like, I write about these ideas at a generic level, because I'm not writing just about learning languages or just about learning math, but obviously there's much more specific ones. So, I could write a very different book if it was just going to be about how to learn physics, or just going to be about how to learn computer programming, because there's a lot of meta learning stuff that just applies to those fields.
Right. And I'm a very visual learner. I'm kidding. I think it is it is worth as strange as this whole thing is. I think it is something that is so deeply stuck in people's psyches, including like at university, where you would expect people to be updated with the latest ideas of how people learn, and it's the
like
temple of learning,
styles?
right? Yeah, learning styles.
Yeah.
So maybe it is worth just you debunking that for a minute, or not that. Like, just could you tell me where does this temptation come from? Which is like, I'm a visual learner, I'm an auditory learner, and what's the sort of evidence for that?
I mean, I think there's a lot of, I'll call them like low research backing memes that they just, for one reason or another, they just kind of like, they fit our intuitive picture of things. And so they become really popular, even though there's good research that they're not true, right? So like learning styles is one. What are some other ones? I don't know. I mean, Malcolm Gladwell's popularization of the 10,000 hour rule is another one that like I have serious issue with. But like it's just like a really good meme. Like, it's just, and so I think most people haven't spent that much time thinking about learning in general. Even people who do a lot of it, you're not always thinking about how do you learn and how does learning work. And even less often are people like really reading the research. I mean, the research for learning is just so much more myriad and messy, and like it's all over the place. So it's a lot harder, I think, to get a good bird's eye view picture of the field, because it's not like physics where there's like three major principles and like everyone agrees on them, and there's just so much stuff out there. So I do think you can have times where like one paper will show this, and it'll be like super influential, and then there'll be like 8 papers being like, well, no, that actually doesn't work. So I think learning styles was probably like that there was some early enthusiasm for the idea, because it's an idea that seems intuitive and people liked it, it spread. And then all the like, actually, no, this doesn't work out, just doesn't carry as much weight or currency. So the learning styles theory, I'll briefly explain it, and then I won't give the full debunking of it. I suggest everyone who is like a full adherent of learning styles to check out Daniel Willingham has a learning styles FAQ. He is a Harvard-trained cognitive psychologist, so you should believe him and not me with why this idea doesn't work. But the basic idea of learning styles theory is that people might have different learning types. So there's been lots that have studied, but the most common one is like visual, auditory, kinesthetic. So, and the idea is that if I get my learning materials in the same modality or my preferred modality, then I will learn better than if it's in not my preferred modality. And you could do an experiment to see if that's true. So you give people the same subject and you make an audio format and a visual format, and you see, do you do better if you receive things that match your preferred modality? And the answer is, well, no, it doesn't actually work that way. So the thing the reason I think it kind of sticks around is there's a similar idea, which is not learning styles theory, but it probably is true. And that's the idea that some people have greater kinesthetic, auditory, or visual strengths. So you might be someone who has a better spatial reasoning ability. And so that allows you to handle skills and subjects that have a spatial component better than other people do. I mean, Albert Einstein sort of famously, when they took his brain in formaldehyde and they pulled it apart, he had like a bigger part that was responsible for spatial reasoning, which kind of makes sense if you're thinking about doing physics thought experiments about time and space warping and stuff. But but it doesn't mean that, okay, we take the Albert Einstein brain that's really good at spatial reasoning and give it, some verbal fluency task or, throwing a football or something. And it's just like, well, if we present it in a visual way, he'll learn it better. So I do think there probably are people who have different strengths, but that doesn't mean that they have different styles. styles must mean that if I modify the instruction, you'll get better results if it's in a different modality.
Sure. Yeah. So there you have it, everyone. You're not an auditory learner. It's debunked.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we did start the discussion with meta learning, and the point that I did want to come at is you have this. You do recommend with people undertaking learning projects that certain amount of that time be spent in meta learning, and sort of gathering materials or formulating a plan. And I think that's something that I feel I do more than my peers around me, and it feels a bit of a like a ninja concept in some ways, that I'm spending time which is not exactly doing what I am, but it's still helping what I'm supposed to be doing. So remind me what did you give like a certain percentage in your first book? And,
I gave a rule of thumb of like 10%. I don't know whether that's exactly right. It was just sort of a rule of thumb, like, okay, if you're spend 100 hours on a project, 10 hours spent meta learning, probably. But the trade-off point might differ, though. I mean, I don't want to say that it's always going to be exactly that ratio, but yeah, it feels like a pretty fair thing that most people don't do 10%, or they don't do enough, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was just wondering, since you've learned many skills, and if it would actually be very helpful if you could just tell us what kinds of learning projects you have done. I think it will be quite beneficial to the listener. And then how would you, or how have you implemented meta learning, or 10%, if you will, in it?
So I've done some public projects, which were like, especially in my early days of blogging, when this was a more popular thing to do. I did these like challenges where I was like, okay, I'm going to learn this. And then I'm like documenting myself doing it and then publishing. So I have a few of those at the MIT challenge, learning MIT's computer science curriculum. That was my first big one. I've learned, I did a project with a friend. We went traveling. We learned 4 different languages. We called it the Year Without English because we weren't speaking in English. I did one learning quantum mechanics. I did one learning my wife's language, Macedonian. I did one doing portrait drawing. That one, the little image, the side-by-side, tends to be when people like have recaps of ultra learning. That's the thumbnail I see all the time, is my little side-by-side day 0, day 30 self-portrait. But I've also learned a lot of skills that were not public projects. So, I've learned to ski, I've learned to paint, I've learned, lots of business skills. That's actually what I do right now, is I run an education business. I have a course business. So that's actually my profession. All these other things are, to a certain extent, kind of just hobbies.
Right.
But, and then of course, not just skills, but like fields of knowledge. So, writing this last book, I've probably read, like 150 books and maybe 600-700 papers. So that is also kind of knowledge. It's not necessarily a skill, but it's a knowledge thing. So these are some of the things that I have learned in the past. And so for meta learning, I think particularly if there's some structure to the skill, I think it's very difficult to do meta learning if there has to be some kind of generalizable principle you can learn. So meta learning works really well for something like languages, where it's like, okay, I know I'm going to need to learn vocabulary, and I know I'm going to have to learn like many, many, many things of the same type. And so there's a hierarchical kind of like, okay, if I understand the principle of vocabulary learning, then if I make this fixed investment in doing the meta learning for what's the right way to learn vocabulary words. And so I learned like the keyword mnemonic, I learned flashcards, I learned, okay, well, you don't want to just do flashcards. You want to do a certain amount of input base because there's this context. Like if I learn these things, maybe that takes me like an hour or two. I'm going to get much, much more than an hour or two of savings learning 10,000 words if I'm studying it, right? I think that's also true of and most well-defined skills. I think there's like this. So chess positions would be another thing. Like I have not done a chess project. I'm a pretty amateur chess player, so I'm knocking chess players, but you could easily crush me in chess. But I have some sense of maybe how chess would work. And I think if I spent a little bit more time going into the chess.com forums and like, what are these crazy maniac chess players? What are they doing for training these days? I'm sure I would pick up techniques. So like there's questions that I don't know the answer to right now, just offhand. I can't derive it from theory, but there would be things like, how much should you be doing games? How much should you be doing chess puzzles? How much should you be doing like real quick decision answers versus slow thinking it out? Like, I think these are all variables that would affect your learning rate. And I don't know whether there's, again, like a correct answer for all of these things, but if you did some meta learning research, you'd probably get a lot closer to the correct decision. So I'll give an example using chess because we're bringing it up. I have a friend who is he really likes chess, but he really likes to just play like the 60-second like bullet games.
Sure.
And I don't know whether like I haven't done all the meta learning from chess, so I'm not going to like refute his strategy, but it doesn't seem like the optimal approach for getting really good at chess to me. Like it seems like this would probably not be the thing that you'd want to do all the time. And I mean, he's been doing this for years and he just likes doing it. I don't think he's like that serious about doing chess, but it's an example where if he spent like, 10 to 20 hours, I'm going to have cutting edge knowledge of like what people who are seriously trying to vie for the world, top chess competition tournaments, like what they're doing to study and to practice. I'm not sure you would end up with that approach, but like you spend that 20 hours doing that, you're going to save, if you're going to do just something else for 10 years, you might end up saving considerably more than 20 hours. So these investments in meta learning, I think they're very important and they can make a huge difference too. Cause sometimes when you're doing this research, you learn that you were wrong about how a technique worked. Like you're wrong about like what actually matters for this. Like, I mean, when I was doing portrait drawing, my first intuition was that, well, people who are really good at drawing faces, it's just tons and tons of like repetitive practice with feedback. And I mean, that is an important component, but I didn't realize that like actually having extremely good like drafting skills, which are actually kind of meticulous and you can't do them very quickly, is very important for getting yourself in the right ballpark so that repetitive practice and feedback can actually work. So there's examples where like if you don't know that like the people who are getting good at this skill are just using a different method than you're using, then you can really go down the wrong rabbit hole of spending tons of time practicing the wrong thing.
Right. Yeah. And, the examples you gave were all meta learning within a system, example chess. I'm curious what your thoughts are on meta learning, quote unquote, with respect to goals, which means, let's say your goal is to have a good and thriving business. Yeah. But the business involves a series of skills, which would be like marketing, which would be sales, which would be a number of things. And this is a common thing where a lot of people will not probably focus on the marketing. The classic coffee barista example of they would just like finesse, have the best coffee ever. Yeah. They would be like put their heart and soul in the coffee, but never let the word out and no one comes to their coffee shop. So how does this generalize to like goals and across various skills?
Oh, definitely. I mean, we're talking about fairly well-defined skills where there's like a large practice component. There's something kind of repeatable here. But a lot of times you're dealing with, I would say, a less well-defined skill. The blurring between meta learning and learning it's not as crisp because you're not learning, let's say, an abstract property that you just repeat for every single instance of the idea. So if I'm learning like how do I improve my business, one of the big things that I do, and I think all really successful business owners do, is that you have a network of other friends that are also running similar businesses and you see what they're doing, you see what's working, what's not working. And it's through this sort of networked kind of hive mind that you learn things about your business. You're like, oh, well, so-and-so is doing that. Well, we're not doing that. Or, oh, this is a good way to do this, or this is a better way to do that. Or I'm encountering problem X. What do you guys think about? Like I'm currently on a WhatsApp group that's for like authors. And it's like incredible to me. Like I didn't have this resource when I was writing Ultra Learning, like how much stuff that I didn't even think about that people are kind of like, people in the group are talking about how do they split test their cover and they're doing these like hundreds of different cover variations and like which one performs better. It's like, oh my God, I didn't do any of that for my first book. And so I think these are situations where, again, the learning and the meta learning can be kind of overlapping. Like if I'm trying to learn about a knowledge domain, so when I was learning about cognitive science and this research, I mean, I had like dozens of calls with like people who I thought were leading experts and I just asked them questions. And specifically, a lot of the questions I was asking is like, well, what should I be reading? Like, what do you think I'm missing? Like, and I remember I had a conversation with one of these educational psychologists and he was thinking, he told me, he's like, you know what, you should also read, like there, because I was focusing on a lot of cognitive science. He's like, you should read Max Wertheimer. He was like one of these early Gestalt psychologists, and he had this book called Productive Thinking. And I mean, the content of that made it into my book, like, because it was important, and I thought it was a useful way of thinking about these ideas. And so I think, again, the more ill-defined the domain is, the more it's like, as you said, it's goal-based, but it's not like clear what skill you're actually learning. The meta-learning versus learning distinction is not as sharp, but you still have to do it. It's just less clear where one starts and the other ends.
Gotcha. Yeah. Let's talk about another critical part of learning, which is feedback.
Yeah.
And so this is almost like the other side, right? Meta learning would be something you probably would start with and sort of get your plan across. But feedback is what would tell you if the meta learning stuff is working or not, or the learning stuff is working or not. And there are clearly systems where feedback is explicit, obvious. Like if I play a note on the piano, it will make that note. And then there are systems, again, to come back to communication skills and emotional intelligence and those sorts of more abstract skills where feedback is not obvious. Like it's not easy for me to tell if I'm being a good conversationalist, because I don't know if that person is having a bad day or did I say something which was weird. So there's more uncertainty in that system. So how, just like I asked you initially about maps of different skills, do you think there's like these maps of skills with respect to feedback? Like some skills are better suited to feedback than others?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of different kinds of feedback, right? So we're not even talking about one thing. And one thing I find difficult about the word feedback is it has a kind of narrower usage. And popular usage of feedback is kind of a little bit more like the teacher telling you what you did right and wrong. And I mean, that's like that kind of corrective or instructional feedback is one kind of feedback. But in the sort of information processing sense, feedback is just a much more general concept of any time like you do something, then information comes back to you that like tells you something. But that is including like when you're skiing down a mountain, feedback is essential, but it's not from the coach, it's from the mountain, right? It's like how you're pushing against it and how your body moves. If you don't have that, you can't learn to ski. So the feedback is incorporated in it. So there's different kinds of feedback, and different kinds of feedback matter differently. But it's very important for learning. So I think part of the goal in writing about, I have a whole section in the book devoted to feedback is just sort of explore some of the different aspects of feedback and how it influences learning, because I do think it's multifaceted. It's not as simple as just saying like, well, there's this thing called feedback and you have to get it, because it's like, well, what do you mean? If you're a stand-up comic, is feedback the crowd laughing? Is feedback getting sales to your, a ticketed show? Is it another experienced comic telling you what's funny and not? Like, what is feedback? Is it watching yourself on videotape? There's lots and lots of different ways to do it, and I think they have different consequences. So it's more than just getting enough feedback. It's about getting the right kind of feedback. And I mean, there's even some situations where getting the wrong kind of feedback, like there's lots of experiments with motor skills, for instance, that if you give people instantaneous feedback about how they're performing a skill, it turns out they can't transfer it. Like they learn a completely different skill in this weird laboratory environment, and they're just like utterly useless. Like if I was like, a skill where I'm like, okay, I have to like throw a baseball at a certain speed, and I'm like showing how fast I'm throwing it. It messes you up for learning it in real life. So there are situations where even, if you get the wrong kind of feedback, is worse than no feedback.
Yeah, I can totally imagine that happening with dance. Like if you were to give me feedback on like every single sort of joint movement, that would probably be counterproductive, because I think the whole point of it might be to get this larger movement correct rather than every single joint.
Or it becomes a crutch, right? Like it's something like if you're used to getting feedback about something and then you don't have it, it can be a crutch in these kind of, especially these movement domains. Like you incorporate the feedback into the skill, and so once you remove it, you have poor transfer because you've learned a kind of a different skill. So there are lots of situations like that. Generally speaking, aside from these sort of edge cases, feedback is good, and you need to get more feedback. And the reason that we're unable to achieve like really high proficiency in a lot of skills, I would argue, is because the environment does not supply the feedback, and we don't necessarily automatically seek it out.
Right. You do write success is the best teacher, or something to that tune. Is that to say that one should aim for positive feedback more often than not?
Yeah, I mean, this it's a little bit of tongue in cheek, but part of it is just because there's so much of this mantra that like, well, we learn more from failure than success, and you got to make all these
Right.
mistakes and this kind of. And I mean, if the
Right.
point of that advice is just that failure is inevitable, if the point of that
Right.
advice is that well, you can't avoid failure, so you might as well like look at it glass half full, then yeah, I support that idea.
Right.
But I just think there's two reasons why you want to have a lot of early success when you're learning things. The first is cognitive, that basically a lot of skills amount to finding the right way to doing something. And it's a little bit like there's all these different settings that you can do for how you can,
Sure.
like there's this huge space of possibilities. And one of them's right, or a few of them are right, and most of them are bad. That's how most learning is finding the few that work. And
Right.
so if you're not doing anything, like if you are able to kind of hone in on those things that work early on, you're going to be much more successful, and you're going to learn the building blocks of the skills much better. So that's one of the ideas, this cognitive argument in favor of like, you do not want to be in a situation where you just continually fail until you finally, through trial and error, figure it out. That's a really terrible way to learn things.
Yeah.
But so that's sort of the cognitive thing that like, if, I can study from an example, I can have someone show me how to do it. If I can learn the building blocks before I approach the bigger problem, and I'm more likely to be successful, then those are good, especially early on. And the motivational piece is also akin to that failure is demotivating. That's very normal when we experience failure. I mean, we were talking about identity. I mean, our brains are constantly trying to figure out what is a good place to invest resources. And when we encounter
Right.
repeated failure, it's a very natural human response to be like, abandon this. This is a dead end. Don't do this, right? And so if you're actually trying to learn something, or if you have to learn something, experiencing a lot of failure early on is really demotivating. It's very hard to keep going through it. And so, I mean, everyone knows this. The thing is that, sometimes people will say, oh, well, you need to like persist through failure. But usually what they're talking about is that if you experience some temporary obstacles and then you experience a success in the end, that can
Right.
reinforce your motivation in a way that's better than if you only experience smooth sailing and then you win.
Correct.
But again, it's a kind of an issue of timing, right? It's sort of like if I, struggle, succeed, then what I've learned is that if I struggle and I keep going, I can eventually succeed. But if I struggle, and then fail, then I maybe learn that I should just give up on things right away and not waste so much time, right? Like you're not
Right.
exactly learning persistence in this environment. So even motivationally, I think we want to bootstrap our confidence, build from early successes, build from small wins, build from things like this. And yes, persistence is important, and working on harder challenges is important, particularly later. And
Right.
that is something that matters, but especially in the beginning, I think we want to ground ourselves with that approach.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to like wrap this idea of feedback, is I know this is hard to answer without a specific skill in mind, but are there like any generic pointers about feedback that you could give away, which might help the listener if they are in any project right now?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if it is a skill where you can get corrective feedback from a coach, that's probably best. Pretty much every field which has the potential for coaching, people do better with coaches.
Right.
There's nuances there. I mean, if you're learning a motor skill, sometimes, again, you don't want the detailed kinematics of your body movements. You want a coach to give you advice in a way so that when you're thinking of the advice, when you're performing the skill, it improves your proficiency. There's a whole domain of research about that. But if we're just talking about like something that doesn't have that complication like chess, having a chess coach that can say, this is the problem, you're doing this a lot, is better than you trying to figure that out just from your win-loss ratio in playing games. So that would be my first thing. But that's not always available. So what other kinds of feedback are good? Well, another thing is that in environments of uncertainty, so where you don't always get the same outcome when you perform the skill the same way. So poker is an example I talk about in the book, but pretty much everything in life has some uncertainty to it. So if you make an investment decision, if you make a hiring decision, if you do these kinds of things, it's been shown that people don't always learn just from outcome feedback in this scenario. So if you are trying to like make predictions about things for your job or your forecasting, and you just tell people whether or not their predictions were right or wrong, they don't, at least in the experiments that I cover in the book, they don't often just magically become better at that skill. In some cases, they even become worse. And so they need calibration feedback too. So you need to sort of be like, not just not just are you like right or wrong in these instances, but like how well calibrated are you? Like, are you confident when you should be confident? Are you uncertain when you should be
Right.
uncertain? So there's different ways you can enhance feedback there. I think like if I were in a position where my job depended on making judgments under uncertainty, so I was a hiring manager, stock picker. I have to pick which projects are going to be successful. The first thing I would do is try to like outsource the intuition. So like use models, use things that will like aggregate information better than I can. And then the second thing would be if I have to rely on my intuition, like I'm making these judgments and they're not entirely something I can just reduce down to a formula. I would want really good feedback on exactly how well I'm making this decision. So if you're in a position where you have to like recruit people, for instance, I wouldn't want to just know, okay, which of my recruits work out, but I would want to like, keep some tabs on people who applied and be like, okay,
Right.
check their LinkedIn, a year or two later, see how my track
Of
record is
course.
for picking winners. Because I think one of the big problems of learning without good feedback is that, a natural progression in skill development is for skills to become increasingly fluent. So fluent meaning they require less effort, they're smoother, you come to the decisions more automatically. What does
Sure.
fluency impart? And fluency imparts confidence. Because there's cognitive ease, when something feels
Right.
easy cognitively, we feel confident with it. But cognitive ease can be misleading, because if you have a lot of cognitive ease with a skill that you're not actually performing that well, you can be grossly overconfident. And so I think in a lot of professions where we
Correct.
have a lot of intuitive judgments, where actual judges, psychologists, hiring managers, I was using these examples, you can be like, well, I've done this for 20 years and like, I know I never make mistakes and I do this kind of thing. And it's sort of like, well, I mean, maybe you're one of the exceptions, but statistically speaking, that's probably not true. And so I think in those cases, it's kind of the opposite of the success point. Like the problem is overconfidence. The problem is feeling like you know this skill really well when you need to have more humility. So I don't know. I think those are good things to think about when you're thinking about feedback.
All right. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for those tips. Right. I do want to sort of start wrapping and start talking about the future of learning. So you have written this book, which reads quite a lot like a literature review. There's it goes, it does, and by that I mean it's quite comprehensive, right? It's like covers various aspects of learning in what feels to be exhaustive. It feels like you have read everything more or less, and so the question here is. So first of all, I personally was a bit concerned with the studies in that a lot of them, because learning is fairly volatile, new, evolving area, that would a lot of these studies would be in the range of 30 to 60 sample size, and
Yeah.
it to me that feels not enough for a skill like learning. And so, are you concerned about these things, and do you think this might change anything about the results that we might see in future?
Well, so I think there's good points. I think if you just want me to stand back and analyze the field of learning as a whole, it's sort of empirical status. I mean, it definitely has problems as a field. So, I would not put the same level of confidence in cognitive psychology, certainly educational psychology, as I would in economics, to name another social
Right.
science, or certainly not like biology or chemistry or something like that, one of these hard sciences. And
Right.
I think even if you spend any time in the field, you hear about a lot of the like not just low sample size, but studies that just can't possibly be measuring what they think they're measuring. And like, so anyone who's spent a lot of time in the field feels as that there's this concomitant risk. Now, how did I approach this in writing the book and kind of keeping this in mind? So the first thing that I really try to do is, even when I'm mentioning specific studies, like I really tried to lean on meta-analyses whenever is possible. So aggregating
Sure.
studies. So like this is what a literature says and not what a particular study says. So that's one thing that was a heuristic for me. Because again, you can find anything if you find a particular study. So usually when I'm mentioning a study, it's just for illustrative purposes. Like I'm not
Right.
basing my opinion of what I'm saying on that particular study. It's just like it illustrates sort of a broader trend. So, when I'm talking about phonics, I think I mentioned like a particular study about how, the influence of phonics instructions and the kinds of readers that early readers are getting that sort of weighs in this sort of success is the best teacher approach. But I mean, I'm picking one thing to talk about from a literature review that was done in 1990 that was the same conclusion of a literature review that was done in the 1960s that is also the same as a literature review that was done more recently in the 2000s. So I mean, we're talking about like, yes, I am cherry picking that one thing, but it is indicative of a broader kind of trend. I think it's just impossible to like talk about this coherently if you don't actually say what the research is doing. And and so the second thing I would say I do is I try to look at broad trends and not worry so much about a lot of the details. So like cognitive load theory, for instance, I think if you get in the fringes of particular studies, like, okay, when do you see the worked example effect? When do you see these effects? That's fine. But the broader conclusions, I think, of the theory largely hold. I mean, it's largely the case that, no one denies that working memory is a bottleneck. No one denies that this doesn't have instructional significances, and like all these kinds of things are important. So that's another thing I think is important too. And then the other thing I try to work on is I really try to work on not picking the newest and flashiest studies. So a lot of my research summary is quite old. So this is stuff that people still to this day are referring back and citing and commenting on, not because necessarily the original study was the best study that was ever done, but because people have done, they've explored the idea further. There has been more work that has been done in and around it. And so, it's not been something that's been thrown in the garbage over time. But I agree with what you're saying. I think just as a high level, like how much confidence can we have in this sort of research? I mean, it is an open question, but I would make the argument that as much as there can be uncertainty surrounding the actual science or understanding, maybe, psychology has gone through these revolutions. It was behaviorism and cognitivism. Maybe there's going to be, cognitive neuroscience is just going to take over and all the psychologists' work is just going to be thrown in the dustbin because actually, we have some different models that are based on like, physics concepts that work better for these kind of fields. That may be the case. But I feel like at the same time, we still need to know how to learn. We still need to practice these things in a regular life. So the kind of alternative perspective, which is just like, well, I'm going to ignore all of this stuff and just focus on like what seems to work for me. I mean, that's a sample size of one that is known to have all these problems. So I still prefer this approach, warts and all, of really understanding, what do people who spend their entire lives debating these issues, really thinking through all the complexities and nuances and contradictory information, what do they think about this, rather than, sometimes studies don't replicate, so I'm going to just throw that in the garbage. But I mean, you're in this field as an academic, so hopefully people like you are going to be reforming and running better studies, and then 50 years from now when they write this book, it's there's going to be even better research to rely on.
Yeah, that's the hope. Like perhaps not individually, but as a field for sure. And I mean, I definitely see a lot of like neurotransmitter-based explanations coming in the future. Like I think at this point we are sort of understanding dopamine. Like every time I hear dopamine, at least in the kind of thing I do is in the context of learning and memory and that sort of a thing. So I do see it going away from the pleasure and that sort of thing, which is half correct, let's say, to more, I think, learning-based sort of explanations. But I guess that was just my musings. My question to you is there anything you see there's like a missing piece that you see coming in the current cognitive psychology approach?
Yeah.
Or
I mean, the trend has definitely been toward cognitive neuroscience. So like if you look at like papers, like all the new stuff is fMRI and like, it's going in that direction, which I think is very good, because I think if you look at like a lot of classic cognitive psychology, it's just done totally divorced from neuroanatomy and brain architecture and this kind of stuff. Like it wasn't able to bridge that gap. So you see these like cognitive models that is sort of like, well, the brain can't possibly work that way. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know what you're saying that the brain actually works this way, but so this is an approximation. I tend to be more optimistic about a lot of cognitive psychology than some people are. I know some people really they just sort of see the neuroscience stuff as being more scientific, but to me it's a hierarchy issue. It's a layer below the psychology stuff. So in some ways, in writing a book about this that has practical implications, I actually like the applied studies more, because, it's one thing for me to say, okay, the basal ganglia motor loop, and we're talking about dopamine and like, this is how it innervates and this kind of thing. But I mean, what's the studying implication for that? I don't know. Like there's probably some, and it's certainly important if you're like researching Parkinson's or something, but if you're asking me what's the right way to, what's the right way to like do a certain kind of training? And it turns out there's like all these studies on like how people have done that training in various circumstances, how it's worked better.
Yeah.
I much prefer that one. So when I was doing this research, like the things that I really liked were, like I was reading research about the use of flight simulators in like pilot training and stuff. Like the military invests a lot of money in these things because they got a lot of research money and they care about training pilots on these multi-million-dollar fighter jets and stuff. And so there's been all this research done that's been on that seems to me to be like, pretty comprehensive. And, or like the phonics stuff, like, reading is such an important part of the curriculum. It's like a super well-studied area of learning skills. And so, I mean, I think it dovetails nicely with a lot of the neuroscience that's been done. But I mean, if you only had the basic science, sometimes it can lead to like sort of misleading application. You can be like, well, because of dopamine, therefore we should do this. But it's actually like, that's a chain of inference that's like 8 or 9 steps deep.
Yeah.
And if one of them's wrong, maybe you get a different conclusion. So I like the stuff that's also, I like the theory, but I also like the stuff that's like close to the field, that's sort of like, well, actually we ran this in a classroom, or we ran this in a study, and this was the result, and this kind of thing,
Yeah. You're articulating very well how badly I fail at parties to explain people how to be more social and that kind of stuff. Like I can tell you it matters. That's what I can tell you. I don't know if I can say more. Sure. I think this is a good time to wrap, and I would just ask this one final question, which is, if you think of this listener right now who is tuning into us, and they're thinking of this learning project that they're doing or want to do, what would be some like practical, actionable things you could tell to them right now that may enhance their journey? Yeah,
I mean, well, we already talked about a few of them. Meta learning, invest some time figuring out how the best people in the world learn the thing that you're trying to learn. And I don't mean that in just some sort of highfalutin way, but just really like, if you're going to learn a language, what are the ways to learn a language? What are the ways to learn vocabulary, grammar, this kind of stuff. The second thing I think is figuring out how to practice appropriately. So I cover a lot of these principles in the book, but I mean, we make mistakes about how to practice, where our brain is kind of an effort-saving machine. And so we find ways to avoid doing the real work when we're practicing. So, if you're like trying to solve problems and you're not actually solving the problem, you're not actually working through it, it's going to be hard for you to learn these procedures. Or if you're trying to remember things and you don't actually practice retrieving the memory, it's going to be harder. And then finally, how can you get feedback at all levels of the process? So feedback from people on like, what's the right way to do this skill, feedback on how am I performing this skill, and all these kind of things. I think if you can enhance the feedback you're getting, you can also accelerate how quickly you learn things.
All right. Yeah. Well, Scott, we covered a lot of ground. We went all the way from directness and non-directness and building blocks to meta learning, to identity-based stuff and its relationship to confidence and emotional intelligence and emotions, rather, just to feedback and how transfer might or might not happen with chess, and how Indian parents might be wrong. And you debunked many myths, especially around learning style. So all I could do is thank you for your time and your expertise with this area, and it's such an incredible area and affects us all. So thank you for the work you do, and thank you for coming to the show.
Oh, well, thank you for having me.